The soft clinking of silverware against porcelain rose steadily through the elegant hush of Aurelio, one of the most exclusive and discreet restaurants in the heart of Chicago. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm amber glow across tables draped in immaculate white, while the gentle sweep of a piano melody drifted through the air like an abandoned promise. I sat across from Brandon, my hands tightly woven together in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. This was a mistake. I knew it the very moment I agreed to see him again. But for weeks now, Brandon had been relentless, calling, texting, leaving flowers at my door with scribbled notes that said we need to talk. "You look beautiful tonight, Maddie," he murmured, syrupy sweet, just convincing enough for anyone nearby to believe this was a romantic date. But I heard the sharp edge beneath his voice, thin and dangerous like a shard of broken glass. His smile never reached his eyes. It never had. "I miss you so much, don't you? Remember what we had?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to stand up and leave, but my body remembered what my mind had begged me to forget. The bruises hidden beneath my long sleeves. The nights I cried silently in the bathroom. The apologies packaged with flowers and hollow promises. I only managed a small nod, my throat too tight for words. "Good girl," he whispered, leaning forward. To anyone watching, we must have looked like a couple finding their way back to tenderness. No one could see his hand clamped around my wrist beneath the table, his fingers digging into the very spot where my skin had only recently begun to heal. "I've been thinking about tonight, about what's going to happen when we leave here." My heartbeat lurched. I knew that tone. It meant he was angry. Tonight he had worn gentleness like a mask, one he had perfected over the years we were together. "When we walk out of here," he murmured so quietly only I could hear, "your body will be covered in bruises for daring to think you could leave me, for ignoring my calls, for making me chase you like an idiot." I swallowed hard, my eyes fixed on the untouched plate before me. The scallops that once looked so inviting now made my stomach twist. I wanted to scream, to ask for help, but who would believe me? Brandon was a respected, successful attorney, and I was just a quiet elementary school teacher who barely raised her voice. "You have nothing to say?" he asked with a smile just as a server passed by. "Good. Very good, Maddie. You're learning." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked hard to keep them from falling. I would not cry in public. I had learned that crying only made things worse. It fed something dark inside him, something that delighted in my fear. And then I saw him, the man at the table beside ours. He sat alone with a glass of whiskey in hand, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that likely cost more than my monthly rent. His hair was neatly combed, glossy under the warm light, and, even from a side angle, I could see the sharp definition of his features, the strong jawline, the glint of an expensive watch. He looked as though he had stepped out of a magazine meant for the wealthy and untouchable. But what struck me most was his stillness. While everyone around us chatted and laughed, he sat utterly composed, his attention seemingly focused on his drink, until it wasn't. His head tilted slightly. His fingers stilled on the rim of his glass, his shoulders tightened by a fraction. He had heard Brandon. I knew he had. And then our eyes met. His eyes were deep and dark, almost black beneath the ambient glow. There was no pity in them, something I had grown so painfully accustomed to. Instead, there was something else. Something that stole my breath for a moment. But then Brandon's voice yanked me back to reality. "I'm going to the restroom. Don't think about running, Maddie. You know I'll find you. I always do." He stood, squeezing my shoulder hard enough to make me wince, then walked away with the confident stride that once made me feel safe and now only filled me with dread. I watched him disappear around the corner, and only then did I exhale. That was when the man at the next table began to move. And if the moment Luca rose, walking toward my table with the quiet certainty of a man who already knew exactly who he intended to protect and why, made your heart skip in your chest, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel, tap the like button, and share this video to keep these emotional stories alive. And where are you listening from? Leave a comment with your city or country so I know where Maddie's journey, her fear, and her fragile hope has reached you in this wide world. He did not rush. He did not display even a flicker of urgency. He rose as though it were simply a natural movement between sips of whiskey, as if he were merely stretching his legs or greeting an acquaintance. But something in the way he moved altered the air around me, Each step he took toward my table was controlled, deliberate, entirely certain. I looked up, my vision blurred with unshed tears, yet unable to look away from him. He was tall, solidly built, but nothing about him felt exaggerated. Everything was understated, from the precise cut of his suit to the way he paused beside my table. His voice was low and steady, carrying a faint trace of an Italian East Coast accent, pitched just loud enough for me to hear while remaining invisible to everyone else. "Forgive the intrusion, but I overheard part of your conversation. Are you here by your own choice?" My mouth opened, but no sound came. I didn't know who he was, why he cared, or whether I could trust him. But some part of me, the part that had almost gone numb, whispered that I should nod, that I should take the hand reaching toward me in the middle of my drowning. His eyes held no pity, only certainty. A kind of assurance that made me believe trust might not be a mistake, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I gave a slight nod, so small that anyone glancing our way would never have noticed, but he saw it. He dipped his head in a silent acknowledgement, as though that tiny gesture was all he needed. Then he stepped away from my table, approached a nearby server, and whispered something. In less than half a minute, 2 men in black suits appeared near the entrance, discreet but unmistakably positioned with purpose. Their gazes swept the restaurant before settling briefly on me. I began to realize I had stepped into something far bigger than I understood. Brandon still had not returned, but my stomach tightened in familiar anticipation. I knew how quickly moments could turn violent, how fast soft words could ignite into rage. But this time, something had shifted. The mysterious man returned to my table, now standing across from the chair Brandon had left empty, his eyes fixed on mine. "I am Luca Devereaux," he said quietly, yet with unmistakable clarity. "I own this restaurant, and I do not tolerate threats made under my roof." My breath trembled, a mixture of fear and a fragile flicker of hope. "I heard every word he said to you," Luca continued, his gaze darkening. "If you want to leave this place safely, just tell me. I will handle the rest." Before I could answer, Brandon returned. His face drained of color at the sight of Luca standing there, and for the first time, I saw him take a small step back. Luca did not move, did not raise his voice. But something about him made the space around us heavy. Brandon forced a smile, brittle and thin. "And who might you be?" Luca turned toward him, his tone unchanged. "I am the man who heard you threaten her." Every single word. Brandon went silent. And for the first time in many months, I felt as though someone was standing between me and the darkness I had grown too used to. Not with noise, not with theatrics, simply with the quiet, unshakable presence of a stranger who chose not to look away. The space around, the table seemed to freeze when Luca Devereaux stood facing Brandon. In that brief moment I could feel the tension swelling beneath the thin surface of forced politeness. Brandon blinked several times, as if trying to figure out who this man was and why he would dare step into his business. But Luca did not give him much time to react. He stood his ground, his gaze never leaving Brandon, his voice as calm and deep as still water. "You have forgotten where you are standing. Or perhaps you are simply too used to no one daring to speak up," Luca said, not raising his voice yet making every word feel weighted. Brandon tilted his head, a cold smile pulling at his mouth. "I think this matter is between me and my ex-girlfriend. Not your concern." "Wrong," Luca replied. "When you sit inside my restaurant and threaten someone, it becomes my concern." Brandon hesitated. He glanced around, noticing a few curious eyes beginning to drift our way, though most guests still had no idea what was unfolding. It felt like a private play performed in plain sight, where only the main actors could understand the script. Brandon attempted to regain ground, at least outwardly. She can speak for herself. "Maddie, do you mind a stranger interfering?" His tone was sweet as syrup, but his eyes brimmed with warning. I did not answer. I simply looked at Luca, as though he were the only solid place left for me to anchor myself. Luca understood. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice lower now, meant only for me. "I will ask once. Do you want to leave with me?" I nodded, slow but unmistakably firm. Brandon saw it, and his expression darkened like storm clouds gathering. "Actually," Luca said, slipping his phone from the pocket of his suit and typing a few swift lines. "We will be leaving now. The 2 men waiting at the entrance will make sure you do not get in the way." Brandon clenched his jaw. Who do you think you are to issue orders like that? I have every right to speak to her. She is someone I know. Luca lifted his head, staring directly into Brandon's eyes, an icy gaze that did not require any further threat. My name is Luca Devereaux. I oversee the security for this entire restaurant and every other establishment within the chain I own. I have cameras, audio, witnesses, and attorneys, if you need them. I also know where you work, where you live, and about the previous incidents in which you threatened other women and managed to slip through without consequences. Do not think I am unaware of who you are, but it seems you have forgotten that I am someone you should never have crossed. Each word struck the air like a nail. Brandon stopped smiling. He looked at Luca, then at me. There was anger in his eyes, but also something new creeping in hesitation. For the first time, I saw him step back not as strategy, but out of fear. Luca did not move. He simply inclined his head toward me. "After you," he said, extending his hand. I stood, my knees trembling slightly but stronger than I expected. When my hand touched his, I felt a quiet strength, solid like earth beneath my feet, unmoving even in storms. Luca gently guided me away from the table, while Brandon stood frozen in place. We walked through the restaurant's foyer, past discreet servers, who watched without staring. At the main doors, the two men dressed in dark suits waited exactly where they had been instructed. One opened the door while the other nodded at Luca. I did not need anyone to tell me that everything had been arranged. As we stepped outside, the cold night air struck my face like a sobering slap. But for the first time in many months, I did not feel alone. Walking beside me was a stranger who had simply heard that I needed help and chose not to walk away. I did not know who he really was or why he cared, but I knew that if I did not leave with him tonight, I might never have another chance to step out of the darkness at all. The moment we passed through the large glass doors of Aurelio, I heard the sharp pounding of footsteps against the stone floor behind us. "Brandon! Madison! What on earth do you think you are doing?" His voice cut through the frigid early winter air like a blade, striking straight between my shoulders. I froze for a second, my body slipping into old instincts that told me to shrink and fold inward. But Luca still held my hand, steady and warm, and he turned to face the man storming toward us with eyes flushed red from fury. Brandon pushed forward, fists clenched, chest heaving. "I do not permit this. She is my ex-girlfriend. This is between us. None of this concerns you." Luca released my hand and stepped in front of me, shielding me with his tall frame. His face remained calm, almost cold, his gaze unwavering. "No, this is a matter of safety. When you threaten a woman inside my restaurant, you make it my business." Brandon let out a mocking laugh, empty and arrogant. "Oh, so you are playing the hero tonight? Do not think wearing a nice suit and talking smoothly gives you the right to interfere. You do not know anything about me." Luca did not laugh. He did not even blink. "Actually," he said, "I know quite a bit." Brandon Hale, 32 years old, attorney at a commercial firm in the Loop, residing on the 4th floor of the Lakeview Plaza building. "You drive a gray Mercedes registered under your mother's name, Miss Cheryl Hale. You have a history of violence involving a former girlfriend from your law school years. The case never went to trial because she withdrew her complaint after you showed up at her home with flowers and apologies." Brandon's face drained of color. How do you know that?" Luca did not answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, his voice lowering, carrying a quiet but crushing authority. "I have people, and my people are fast. When I saw you squeeze her hand under the table, saw her too afraid to speak, I knew I needed to prepare, because I do not tolerate men like you existing in my space without being confronted." Brandon looked around, perhaps searching for an ally, but no one stood with him. One of the two men in dark suits stepped forward, tall and stern, and spoke in a low, controlled tone. "You should leave now, Mr. Hale, immediately." Brandon inhaled sharply, trying to appear confident. "She will come back. Madison, you know we have unfinished business." I did not answer. I did not need to. Luca stepped back slightly, giving me room. I looked directly into Brandon's eyes, for the first time without bowing my head or trembling. "No, we have nothing left to discuss. And if you contact me again, I will call the police." Brandon went silent. There were no sweet words now, no threats, only powerlessness. He spun around and spat out one final angry line. "This is not over," Luca replied without hesitation. "For her, it is already over." Brandon stalked away, his once confident stride shaken. One of the suited men followed him to ensure he actually left the area. Luca turned back to me, his voice softening. "Are you all right?" I wanted to say no, to collapse and cry under the weight of every emotion I had swallowed for so long, but instead I nodded. "I do not know why you did this. You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Luca looked at me for a long moment, his eyes as deep as if holding an entire ocean behind them. "You do not need to know someone to recognize what is wrong. I only did what someone should have done for you a long time ago." A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, stopping right beside us. Luca opened the door and stepped aside, inviting me in. "Come with me. I will take you somewhere safe, just temporarily. After that, if you want to go anywhere else, I will take you." I entered the car without hesitation, because for the first time in years I felt like I was being taken away from danger instead of dragged back into it. And I knew that even if this was only temporary, tonight I had finally been chosen. I was no longer prey. I was someone being protected. The car slipped quietly through the lamplit streets of Chicago, leaving the restless heart of downtown behind as it moved north through the city. Inside, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, steady yet trembling like the fading echo of a storm. Luca sat beside me, saying nothing, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, though every few moments he glanced my way as if to make sure I was still all right. I did not know where we were going, nor did I have the strength to wonder. All I knew was that I was moving away from Brandon, away from the threats, the watchful eyes, the sleepless nights spent in fear. The unfamiliar feeling of distance from him was so new, so fragile, I hardly dared believe it was real. When the car turned down a tree-lined street, the world seemed to shift into something quieter, more secluded. A building appeared ahead with tall glass windows reflecting warm golden light, not the kind meant to impress but the kind that whispered of quiet luxury and discretion. Luca stepped out first, coming around to open my door. His hand reached toward me, steady and grounded like the man himself. I placed my trembling hand in his and rose from the car, my legs still weak even though Brandon was no longer near. He guided me inside through a narrow marble-floored lobby, where the only sound was the soft echo of our footsteps. A man in a suit nodded respectfully at Luca as we passed without asking a single question. The elevator carried us to the very top floor. I did not ask why this floor, perhaps because I no longer remembered how to ask anything at all. I had grown used to not being allowed questions, not being allowed choices. When the doors opened, a spacious, glowing apartment stretched out before me, lit with soft amber lights that warmed the modern yet gentle interior. A charcoal gray sofa, dark wooden shelves, a thick rug beneath my feet, and in the distance a wide window overlooking a city that was finally drifting into sleep. Luca spoke quietly, his voice nearing a whisper. "This place is reserved only for temporary guests. No one knows you are here except me and two people I trust completely. You can stay as long as you need. No one will disturb you." I nodded, my throat tightening around a feeling I had not experienced in almost 2 full years. Not fear, not vigilance, peace. A delicate, trembling peace that felt so breakable I almost feared to touch it. He led me into a separate bedroom where a white-sheeted bed waited, a small table beside it holding a bottle of water and a warm towel. He did not step inside, only stood in the doorway. "Rest. Everything else can wait." I looked at him then, truly looked, and something in his eyes told me he understood in a way that went deeper than sympathy, not just kindness, something born from experience. I nodded softly, my voice barely more than breath. "Thank you." Luca returned the nod and stepped away, the door closing with a sound so gentle yet so final. It tightened something inside my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded together, my eyes wandering across the unfamiliar but strangely comforting room. No threatening footsteps in the hall. No phone vibrating endlessly. No eyes monitoring my every movement. I slipped off my shoes and let my bare feet sink into the velvet soft carpet. Then I lay back on the bed. The mattress seemed to embrace me like a quiet, patient hug. For the first time in many months, my eyelids closed without fear of what waited behind the darkness. I did not know when I drifted asleep, only that in the hazy twilight between waking and dreaming, I heard the gentle rustle of wind outside the glass, and felt the faint tug of a warm blanket being pulled up around my shoulders. No one shook me awake, no shouting, no rage. When I opened my eyes again, the sky outside the window had softened into the pale blue-gray of dawn, and for the first time in far too long, my heart did not feel hunted, only still, only quiet, only hopeful. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, filling the room with a gentle, silvery glow, as if the very air whispered that I was safe. I blinked into the soft brightness, disoriented for a moment. It took a few seconds to remember where I was, and why. The shattered fragments of the previous night returned to me, but instead of sending panic rushing through my veins as they once did, they drifted past like scenes from a film that had already ended. I sat up, the blanket still holding its warmth, and the apartment remained utterly silent. No buzzing phone, no pacing footsteps outside the door. I inhaled deeply, my lungs full and unbroken for the first time in weeks. When I walked out into the main room, a breakfast tray waited on the kitchen counter. Steam curled from a ceramic mug of coffee, sitting beside toast, butter, and a neatly sliced apple. A small note lay next to it, written in firm, slightly slanted handwriting. Just a few words, but enough to make my heart skip. Eat. You need the strength today. L.D. I lifted the coffee to my lips, letting the warmth settle into me, not understanding why such a simple gesture from a stranger made something inside me loosen. Perhaps he pitied me. Perhaps he had seen this before, or perhaps he was simply someone who could not walk away when someone else was drowning. I was still drifting in those thoughts when the doorbell rang, soft and polite. I startled, then reminded myself I was not in my old apartment, and Brandon could not just appear. I walked to the door, checked the peephole, and saw a young woman dressed professionally in a beige coat, her hair swept into a tidy bun. She carried a few paper bags and smiled gently. I opened the door cautiously. "Hello, Miss Clark," she said with a respectful nod. "I am Sarah, Mr. Luca's assistant. He asked me to bring you a few essentials." I stepped aside, surprised as she placed the bags on the counter. Inside were clean clothes, toiletries, a brand new phone still sealed in its box, and a small folder of documents. "I selected the items based on the sizes Mr. Luca provided," she said kindly. "If anything does not fit or is not to your liking, just let me know, and I will replace it today. This is a temporary phone. Your old number may have been monitored or controlled. He advises you not to use it for now." I opened the new phone box, but before I could power it on, my old phone buzzed in my bag. I did not need to look at it to know. Brandon, 12 missed calls. 7 messages, one after another. His words swung from feigned worry to irritation to pleading. "What are you doing? I am sorry. You do not understand what I have been dealing with. Maddie, do not turn your back on me. You owe me a response." I stood frozen, my heart hammering again, even though logic told me he could not reach me here. But the feeling of being watched, cornered, followed, it clung like ink on skin, not easily washed away overnight. Sarah stepped beside me, her voice soft as a breeze. "If you like, I can help you transfer any important data to the new phone, and block the old number." I looked at her, hesitating for a moment. Then I nodded. "Yes, please." She smiled gently, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She moved through the settings with quick efficiency, transferred my files, and pressed the block button. A small beep sounded. I had not expected such a small sound to feel like a stone lifting from my chest. She set the old phone aside. "It is done," she said. "You do not have to hear another word from him." I did not speak. I turned toward the wide window where the morning sun brushed soft gold across the buildings. I felt the invisible thread that had tied me to him for so long snap at last. And in that quiet moment I realized something simple yet profound. I had done something I once believed I was incapable of. I had said no. And this time, I was not taking it back. The days that followed moved in a quiet rhythm I had never known before. Each morning I left the apartment on the top floor with my new phone, a new coat, and a calmness settling inside me that I did not dare to name. I took my usual bus to the elementary school where I taught 2nd grade, still smiling at colleagues and the children who bubbled around me as though nothing had changed. But inside me lived another version of myself. A Madison learning to walk again on legs that had trembled for far too long. I stood before the chalkboard, writing letters in pale strokes, teaching them how to blend sounds, telling fairy tales, solving simple math problems, and somehow those small lessons seemed to quietly mend something fractured in me. The children did not know I had just stepped out of a nightmare. They did not need to know. They only needed my warm voice reading stories and my smile when they raised their hands as high as they could. And I needed them more than I realized. Every innocent laugh felt like a soft blanket draped over, bruises that still throbbed beneath the surface. But when the dismissal bell rang and the schoolyard emptied, I returned to another world. The apartment Luca had arranged became the place where I removed every mask I had worn for survival. In the evenings, I learned how to live with myself again. Sarah still visited often, bringing books, warm meals, and sometimes simply sitting beside me without saying a word. She did not ask questions, did not pry, and I knew that was Luca's doing. He did not interfere, did not suffocate me with frequent appearances, yet his presence felt constant, like an invisible barrier standing firm between me and the memories that still clawed at the edges of my mind. One Wednesday night, when I had just set my bag down and kicked off my worn flats, I saw a small package left at my door. No sender name, only a handwritten note. "I thought you might like this." Inside was an old, slightly frayed book titled, "The Strongest Woman You Will Ever Know Is Yourself." I flipped through the pages and found sections lightly marked in pencil, small handwritten notes in the margins. Every line felt like a gentle whisper, as if someone were speaking directly to me through paper and ink. I did not have to ask to know it was from Luca. The slanted handwriting, the chosen quotes, it was unmistakably him. From that night on, I read a few pages before bed. And at some point, without even realizing when it began, I started to write. I opened my laptop, with no purpose and no particular theme, just fragments of thoughts, short paragraphs, messy lines about fear, about memories, about what it felt like to sit in a quiet room without worrying that the door might burst open. Writing helped me touch the places inside myself I had avoided for so long. Writing made me feel real. And then one evening, I decided to send Luca a message. Just a simple sentence. "Thank you for the book. I am reading page 43, and it made me cry." He did not respond immediately, but that night, when I walked into the kitchen, there was a new herbal tea set on the counter beside a warm water pitcher. The handwritten label read, "Good for sleep. You have cried enough for today." I smiled to myself, my lips still salty with dried tears. I did not understand what exactly existed between Luca and me, nor why he cared in the way he did, but I no longer felt alone. I no longer curled up in fear when I slept. I no longer checked the door lock 3 times. I began to believe that maybe I deserved a life without shouting, without bruises. By day, I was Miss Madison Clark, the gentle second-grade teacher with kind smiles and sticker rewards. By night, I was a woman learning how to love herself again under the quiet protection of a man who had never asked anything of me except that I simply be, and perhaps that was the beginning of healing. Not through miracles, but through small, steady rituals, repeated day after day, until I realized that I was becoming someone new. On Friday night, just as I hung my coat on the rack and prepared a simple soup like I always did, the doorbell rang. Not hurried, not sharp, just a gentle chime like a soft reminder. I opened the door and found Luca standing there, holding a large paper bag and a bottle of red wine. He wore a deep indigo shirt and dark jeans, more casual than I had ever seen him, yet no less composed. He smiled, his eyes quietly searching mine. Before I could speak, he said, "I hope you have not had dinner yet. I brought lasagna, my mother's recipe." I stepped aside and nodded, part surprise, part a warmth blooming unexpectedly in my chest. He walked inside without glancing around the apartment to evaluate or judge the way Brandon always had. Instead, he placed the bag on the kitchen counter and carefully unpacked everything with slow, mindful movements. I sat on the high chair by the bar counter, my hands folded on my lap, unsure how to begin any conversation. But Luca did not let the silence sit too long. He poured wine into 2 glasses and slid one toward me, a quiet invitation, never a demand. We lifted our glasses, barely touching them together as though we were afraid to disturb the peaceful air around us. I asked softly, "Why today?" Luca smiled, answering with gentle simplicity. "Because today you completed the first week of your new life. I saw that you wrote an ending to a very old chapter. I just wanted to share a quiet dinner with you, like two ordinary people. Those words slowed me to stillness. Two ordinary people. I could not remember the last time I had felt ordinary, not scrutinized for every word, every look, every breath. In that warm kitchen filled with golden light and the scent of melted cheese and basil, I felt it happening. We ate in quiet comfort, exchanging small stories about work, about the book I was reading, about the tiny cafe Luca visited each morning. He spoke with calm, steady tones, not performative, not trying to impress. There was patience in every word he chose. He did not touch the memories I had not yet healed, did not ask about Brandon, did not probe the cracks still tender beneath my skin. Instead, he talked about winters in Italy, about his grandmother who made hot chocolate with cinnamon, about the time he first learned to drive and nearly sent the car into a ditch. I laughed, truly laughed, not the polite laugh I had practiced for so long. And when I laughed, Luca did not stare at me the way Brandon had, as if measuring whether my joy belonged to someone else. He simply listened, then said softly, "Your smile is gentle, but it stays with people." I flushed, not from embarrassment, but because my heart slowed for a beat. I had never imagined that I could sit alone with a man without bracing myself for impact. But tonight, I felt safe, not because of the wine, not because of the lasagna, because someone saw me without requiring me to apologize for existing. After dinner, Luca helped me clean up, washing dishes as though he had done it 1,000 times. When everything was put away, he stood by the door, not in a hurry to leave, simply present. He looked at me and asked quietly, "Are you all right?" I nodded, answering truthfully for the first time. "I am." Luca smiled, and before turning to go, he added one more line, as if he had been holding it for the right moment. "Thank you for letting me be a small part of your evening." I closed the door behind him, my heart still warm. I rested my forehead against the wood, not sure what exactly I was stepping into. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever this was, it was unlike anything that had come before. And this time, I might not have to walk alone. I did not want to return to my old apartment, yet there were things I had not taken with me, small personal belongings, a few books I used to read every night like a ritual, to forget the sound of arguments, and a small wooden box that held the letters my mother wrote before she passed away. I had avoided going back, for weeks, but on a Saturday afternoon, as the sunlight tilted toward the west, I decided I needed to do it. Sarah offered to come with me, but I refused. I wanted to face it myself, to prove I could step into that space again without falling apart. I took a cab, asked the driver to stop at the corner, and walked the rest of the way alone. The building looked exactly as it had the day I left, old, worn with time, wrapped in a thin layer of dust and unnamed memories. I climbed the stairs, my palm damp as I touched the doorknob. I opened the door, inhaled deeply. Everything inside was as it had been, nothing out of place, only the heavy air still holding the echoes of old fights, sleepless nights, and the sound of my silent tears. I packed quickly, refusing to let myself drift into the past. I bent down to retrieve the wooden box from the nightstand drawer when I heard the door slam behind me. My heart tightened. I spun around and saw him. Brandon. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, with fury, his eyes bloodshot, and I knew he had not come by chance. He had waited for me. I froze, the wooden box still in my hand. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, each step slow and deliberate. "I knew," he said, his voice low and cold as steel. "I knew you would have to come back. That box, you were never going to leave it behind." I stepped back, my hand trembling. "Brandon, you shouldn't be here. Whatever we had is over." He let out a twisted laugh. "Over? You think hiding in someone else's apartment for a few weeks and changing your number is enough to erase everything?" He came closer, the pretense gone from his eyes. "Who is he? That man in the suit? What did he give you that made you think you could turn your back on me?" I clutched the box tighter, stepping back until I brushed against the table. "I owe you no explanation. I blocked you, and I will call the police if you don't leave," Brandon snarled. "Call them. You think they will believe you instead of me? I am successful. You are a mediocre teacher with no evidence, no witnesses to the stories you make up." He raised his hand, and in an instant, I recognized the violence in his eyes. That hand had slammed into the wall beside my head, had wrapped around my throat just tight enough to terrify without leaving marks. But this time, I did not back away. Before he could touch me, a voice came from behind him. "Enough!" Brandon whipped around. Luca stood in the doorway, his expression taut as a drawn wire. His eyes no longer held the calm I had seen so many nights, but a fury pressed deep into silence. "She said no," he said, stepping inside with steady, decisive strides. "And when a woman says no, it means no." Brandon glared at him. "What are you doing here? Following me?" Luca did not answer. He reached behind him, and I saw he was holding a small recording device. "I have everything. From the moment you shut the door to the threats you just made. And if you think you are the first man I have had to confront, you are mistaken." Brandon froze. I watched him step back. For a fleeting second, the man who once made me tremble at the sound of his footsteps was retreating before the same stranger whose quiet gaze had once felt like safety across a restaurant. Luca moved forward, placing himself between us. "Get out. This is your warning. Next time, you will explain yourself in court." Brandon said nothing more. He shot me one last look, filled with hatred, then turned and slammed the door as he left. When the door clicked shut behind him, the room fell into deep silence. Luca turned toward me, his eyes softening. I stood there holding the wooden box against my chest, tears falling without sound. He walked closer, not touching me, only standing by my side. "You never have to come back here again. Never." And for the first time in my life, I believed that. Believed I could walk away and never look back. We left the old apartment as evening settled in, neither of us speaking during the ride home. I sat in the passenger seat, the wooden box held tightly in my lap like a lifeline, but my mind was empty, as though everything inside me had shattered the moment Brandon entered that room. When the car stopped outside the building, I did not step out immediately. I sat still, my fingers twisted together, staring through the window at the rush of cars sweeping toward some other part of the world where things did not feel as tangled as they did inside me. Luca turned off the engine and looked at me. His voice was low and slow. "Madison, there is something I need to tell you, and I apologize for keeping it until now." I turned toward him, a faint thread of fear rising in my chest. I didn't speak. I only looked at him. He drew a long breath. "I had someone investigate Brandon, not just because of what I saw that night in the restaurant, but because of the way you looked when he walked toward you. I knew that wasn't the first time. I needed to be sure. My heart tightened. I knew he had helped me, protected me, quietly built a barrier between me and the man who had stolen my sleep for so long, but an investigation that was something I had never imagined. What did you find?" I asked, my voice thin and rough, as though spoken by someone else. Luca unlocked his phone, opened a scanned file, and handed it to me. My hands trembled as I read the first line. Names of women. 4 of them, each with a story. A medical report, a withdrawn complaint, a disciplinary note from law school, a recovered message thread, evidence that did not need to scream to make my stomach twist. None of them carried their accusations to the end. None of them were believed. And every single one of them had the same link: Brandon. I folded the phone shut, placed it on my lap, unable to look at Luca. "How long after meeting me did you investigate him?" I asked. Luca did not turn away. "The very first night. When you said no with your eyes. I have seen that look before, and I did not want to wait, until it was too late." I let out a hollow laugh, one with no joy in it. I held my head in my hands as tears broke free again. Not the terrified tears of the past, but tears of something heavier: grief, anger, understanding. Why did no one say anything? Why didn't anyone believe them? Why didn't I know? Luca did not try to soothe me. He spoke quietly, with a truth that landed like a stone. Because men like him know how to hide behind their charm. And because too often, the world does not believe a woman when she is hurting. They say she is exaggerating, that without bruises there is no violence. I cried, not out of fear this time, but from pain, from fury, from the realization that everything I thought was my fault was part of a pattern repeated long before me. I was one among many, a dot in a long line of silence. Luca extended his hand, not touching me, just offering it, a quiet invitation, in case I needed it. I did not take it, but I knew he was there. And in the middle of my chaos, one truth rose clearer than ever. I had stepped out of the darkness, but the darkness did not belong only to one man. It belonged to a system that had allowed him to continue. I was not the only victim. But perhaps, this time, I would be the voice, and I would not be silent anymore. The new apartment sat in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city, a place untouched by car horns or the frantic pulse of downtown, where the trees shed their leaves in slow spirals, and the misty mornings made everything feel softer. Luca had arranged all of it before I even knew what to ask for. It was not too large, not too far from the school, and no one knew this address except him, Sarah, and a man named Marcus who handled Luca's personal security. When I stepped inside, light from the wide window spilled across the living room, warming the wooden floor, and the faint scent of mint rising from a small candle on the shelf pulled a quiet breath from my chest. Not a breath of exhaustion, but release. As though my body finally believed it no longer needed to stay braced for impact. Luca did not linger. He placed the keys on the kitchen counter and told me softly that everything had been checked. The security system was active, and my phone would now connect only to the numbers on a safe list. Before leaving, he set down a folded note with the name of a therapist he trusted. I held that paper the rest of the afternoon, not reading it fully, just letting it rest on my knee like a quiet reminder that I did not have to untangle everything inside me alone. My first appointment was on a Wednesday afternoon after school. The office was small and simple, nothing like the sterile rooms I had feared. Dr. Amanda Smith, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and a voice as soft as wool, did not ask me to recount everything from the beginning. She only asked how I felt today, and I sat in silence nearly 10 minutes before I could whisper a single sentence. I feel tired as if I have been carrying a world no one else can see. She did not push. She simply sat there, nodding now and then, as though her quiet presence was its own form of medicine. The next week, I spoke about Brandon. About the nights he blocked my doorway, about the first time his hand closed around my throat, and later he cried, begging forgiveness, and I believed that love meant understanding. I told her about the days I avoided short sleeves so no one would see the marks, and about the shame of smiling in front of coworkers, while every inch of me wanted to scream that I was being suffocated. Amanda took no notes. She did not ask why I had not left sooner. She said only that sometimes we survive by doing the best we can with what we know at the time. I was not weak. I was a survivor. That sentence stayed with me for days, a shard of light pulsing through a long, dark corridor. I began writing again, not to make accusations, but to remember who I had been and who I wanted to become after everything. Each day in the classroom, I felt a little steadier. Each afternoon at home, I put on soft music, read a few pages of a book, watered the plants on the balcony. The small things became the foundation of a life being rebuilt from ash. Luca did not appear often, but his messages asking if I was doing all right or sending a picture of a sunset with the words, "This looks like your window," were enough to remind me he was still there, a quiet anchor. I still could not name what I felt for him. I was not ready, but I knew if someone ever stepped into my life again, they would meet me as I truly was, not the distorted version shaped by someone else. A free, whole, steady Madison. And the first step on that path had been saying yes to therapy, not for anyone else, but for myself. I cannot recall when we first began to talk about personal things. It happened naturally, as though the space between us slowly filled with gentle exchanges each time he stopped by with hot coffee or a small box of pastries from the cafe he liked. Some days he stood at my door only a few minutes to hand me an old book he thought I might love, found in a second-hand store. Other times he came in out of an unexpected rainstorm, and we ended up sitting in the living room for hours, talking about nothing and everything. Luca rarely spoke about himself, but he did not hide either. He told me about his childhood in Italy, about moving to America at 12, about his father teaching him to look people in the eye because that was the only way they would know he meant what he said. He spoke about the early years working within his family's organization, something I understood only vaguely as a world he was trying to reform from within, using his own principles rather than the violence outsiders often imagined. I listened, sometimes surprised, sometimes puzzled, but never afraid, because the way he shared was gentle and steady, without boasting or secrecy. He was a man who had seen the darker corners of life, and for that very reason, knew how to safeguard peace for others. One night we sat on my balcony, wrapped in the cool autumn air, the glow of the city distant and warm. He brought 2 mugs of hot cocoa, and we said nothing for the first few minutes. Then I spoke, without planning or fear. I told him about my mother, about the nights we lay, listening to the rain tapping the roof while she told me how she had left my father to raise me alone. I told him how she used to say, "Women are not born strong. They learn it by walking away from the wrong men." When I reached that part, Luca did not respond with words. He only placed his hand gently over mine, careful and soft, as if afraid the touch might break me. It was not a touch of possession but of kinship. I told him about my first year in Chicago, my early days teaching, the time I fixed a broken outlet in my tiny rented studio because I didn't want to call Brandon for help. I told him how proud I once felt for being able to do everything alone, until I realized that living alone does not always mean living well. Luca listened through all of it, not interrupting, not offering advice, simply holding the space steady for me. When I finally grew quiet, he said softly, "Madison, you are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to lean on someone without thinking it makes you weak." I turned to him, letting my eyes stay on his longer than usual. I did not know what I was searching for, but what I saw was honesty. Unguarded and gentle, a man who saw me more clearly than I sometimes saw myself. Our friendship deepened in the days that followed, not with grand gestures or midnight confessions, but in small, almost invisible moments. The time he fixed the squeaky hinge on my door without mentioning it. The day I brought home the candy he once said he loved as a child. We moved carefully around each other, sharing without intruding, close without pressing. And for the first time, I did not fear someone getting near, because he did not pull me toward him. He simply waited, steady and patient, until I stepped forward on my own. That night, a light autumn rain fell over the balcony, misting the air beneath the warm glow from inside. Luca arrived later than usual, his coat damp, his hair tousled by the wind, yet his eyes were calm as always. I handed him a towel, and instead of sitting in the living room, I led him to the balcony, where 2 chairs faced the quiet street below. We sat together, sipping cocoa, sharing small pieces of our days, the kind of details that meant little yet somehow eased everything. Perhaps it was the weather, or the dim light, or the closeness that had grown so naturally between us. But when he turned to look at me, I did not look away. I let my eyes meet his fully, without armor, without retreat, and then I reached for his hand. Not a full clasp, just the quiet brush of my fingertips seeking the back of his hand, a small signal that I no longer wished to keep distance. Luca did not pull away. He turned his palm upward, offering it, letting my hand settle into his. The silence that followed was warm and full, a silence that softened the world. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line I had been afraid to approach for months. I stood and walked inside. Luca followed. I did not speak, only guided him toward the bedroom, not because I wanted anything rushed, but because I wanted him close, to know what it felt like to wake and find someone still there. When I turned back, standing in the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I saw conflict flicker briefly in his eyes. I stepped closer, touching his neck lightly, feeling the warmth of his skin and the steady beat beneath my fingertips. I leaned in and brushed my lips against his, slow and gentle, not out of passion, but out of a human longing for safety shaped into the form of another person. But when I moved to deepen the kiss, Luca placed his hands on my shoulders, not firm, not cold, but tender. He stepped back slightly, meeting my eyes, his voice low, hardly more than a whisper. "Madison, I want this. I truly want this, but not now, not tonight." I stood still, stunned not by refusal but by the tenderness in it, a sweetness so unexpected it tightened something deep in my chest. I looked down, suddenly small, as though reminded that everything, even healing, has its own pace. Luca lifted a hand to my cheek, brushing away a drop of rain or a tear, I could not tell which. "You do not have to prove anything. I am not here to take anything from you. I want to stay when you are ready, really ready, not out of loneliness, not out of gratitude, but because you genuinely want it." I nodded, my throat thick. I had never heard words like that directed at me, nothing defined by obligation or the cost of being cared for. Luca had never asked for anything. He only showed up. I asked him to stay not in my room, but in the living room. He agreed. Before I fell asleep, he pulled my blanket up and wished me good night, something he had done before. Yet this time there was a quiet closeness between us that felt new. I slept deeply that night, without dreams, without waking in fear. Only the steady sound of rain on the roof and the soft comfort of knowing that in the next room was someone who would wait without rushing. And for the first time, I did not feel like a woman who needed to be saved. I felt like a woman who was being respected, completely, without condition, without limits. The next morning, I woke to soft sunlight slipping through the curtains and the quiet clink of something being set down in the kitchen. I did not have to guess to know it was Luca. He had a way of making the air around him feel warm without ever saying a word. I stayed in bed a few extra minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling as light as someone who had finally stepped through a door they had spent too long afraid to open. The feeling of being cared for without having to trade anything, without having to earn it, without fear of the cost, was something I never believed I could touch. But this morning, with the scent of coffee drifting through the air and the soft rhythm of his footsteps outside the room, I knew it was real. When I stepped out, Luca was setting 2 cups on the table, a gentle smile resting on his face, the kind I had grown used to and yet still felt quietly grateful for. We ate breakfast in easy silence, not rushed, not pressured to fill the space with words. I found myself watching him a moment longer than usual, and for the first time something in me spoke clearly, no longer shaped by gratitude or the relief of safety. It was affection true, steady, deep, so natural it felt like my heart had chosen long before my mind admitted it. I loved him. Not because he was strong or because he had saved me, but because he saw me without trying to fix me, without reshaping me, simply by being there. I planned to tell him when the moment felt right, but then my phone rang, shattering the fragile stillness. It was Sarah. Her voice was taut, sharper than I had ever heard it. I put the call on speaker and listened to each word land with chilling clarity. Brandon had been arrested that morning for assaulting another woman. She was a new coworker, barely a few weeks into the job. After a small office gathering, he offered to drive her home. The neighbors called the police when they heard screaming and saw her running from his apartment, her face covered in blood. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. I sank into my chair, gripping the edge of the table. Sarah added that this time the victim was not retracting her statement. There were witnesses, medical reports, and most importantly, precedent. With the evidence Luca had collected earlier, the attorneys were able to support her quickly, making it impossible for the case to be buried as before. Brandon had been handcuffed at his office. This time, there would be no escape. I said nothing for long. Minutes after the call ended, Luca stayed beside me, watching quietly, not urging me to speak, not crowding me with concern. When I finally lifted my eyes, what I felt was not sorrow but a sharp, steady clarity. What brought tears to my eyes was not that Brandon would go to prison, but the realization that I had never been the only one. I had thought I was the worst of his cruelty, but I was merely one of many, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I could not stay silent. I would testify, not only to speak my truth, but to tell that woman she was not alone, to show that men like Brandon could be stopped. Luca placed his hand gently over mine, grounding me with nothing more than quiet presence. I turned toward him, drew a breath, and for the first time said what I had kept, folded inside for weeks. I think I've fallen in love with you." There was no surprise in his eyes. Only a soft smile and a slow nod, as though he had been waiting for those words for a very long time. And when he whispered that he felt the same, my heart settled into itself, finally at ease, stronger than it had ever been. We left the city on a clear Saturday morning, sunlight gentle, the crisp breath of autumn curling through the cracked window of the car. Luca did not tell me where we were going, only that he wanted to show me a place he visited whenever he needed quiet. I did not ask, content with the small flicker of excitement rising in me like a child being taken somewhere secret. The drive took more than 2 hours, winding through long stretches of empty road, lined with trees shifting from green to gold. When the car turned onto a narrow dirt path blanketed with fallen leaves, I realized the sound of the city had completely vanished. No traffic, no voices, only the whisper of wind and the crunch of tires over dry earth. A small cabin appeared between the trees, modest and sloped-roofed, with a thin ribbon of smoke drifting from the chimney like a silent greeting. Luca shut off the engine and turned to me, his eyes unusually gentle. "Are you all right?" I nodded, smiling softly. More all right than I expected. He circled the car, took my hand as I stepped onto the cold, living ground. Inside, the cabin was warm, as if it had been waiting for us. Luca lit the fireplace, made 2 cups of herbal tea, then settled into an old leather chair beside the window where sunlight painted a long stripe across the wooden floor. I sat across from him, hands wrapped around the warm cup, gazing into the forest beyond the glass. After a long silence, I asked quietly, "Is this your home?" He nodded. "It was my grandfather's, then my father's, and now mine. I come here when I need to think, when the world gets too loud." I turned to him. "And today, you brought me here because—" Luca looked at me, his gaze deep and unhurried. "Because I think you're strong enough now to look back at everything without letting it swallow you. You've come a long way, Madison, and I want you to see that." I set my cup down, my chest stretching with something I could not name, gratitude, perhaps, or something gentler. When I looked into his eyes, I no longer saw the woman who once flinched at footsteps behind her. I saw someone rebuilding, fragile and new, but whole in ways I had not been for years. "Are you ever afraid?" I asked, my gaze still on the trees outside. "Afraid of the things you cannot control?" Luca was silent a moment before answering. "Yes, every day. But I've learned that fear is not the enemy. It just reminds us that some things matter so much we cannot bear to lose them. Like you." I turned toward him, my throat tightening. He continued, his voice soft but steady. "When I met you, I didn't think I would care for anyone like that again. My life was ordered, structured, contained. And then you arrived quiet, unassuming, just being yourself. And somehow, that changed everything." I could not speak. I simply rose from my chair, crossed the room, and lowered myself to the floor beside him, resting my head gently against his knee like someone returning to warmth after too long in the cold. He placed a hand on my hair, stroking with a tenderness that soothed every unnamed fear in me. In that moment, I understood that love was not made of grand promises or sweeping romance. It was mornings like this, when someone brings you to the safest place they know, not to force you to love life again, but simply to give you shelter if the world ever becomes too big. And I knew I did not love Luca merely because he had pulled me from the dark. I loved him because he let me walk into the light on my own, and waited patiently until I realized he was where I wanted to return. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the trees, scattering broken patterns across the cabin floor. I kept my head resting against him, eyes closed, listening to his heartbeat and the faint rustling of leaves outside the window. Our silence no longer felt like a gap, it felt like a place where unsaid things could soften and warm. I lifted my head and found him watching me. There was nothing rushed in his gaze, only a deep gentleness, like the surface of a quiet autumn lake holding all the light of the sky above it. Luca brushed his hand along my cheek, his thumb traveling lightly over my skin as though he were drawing something there, not possession, but reverence. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice scarcely above a breath, meant only for me. I met his eyes without hesitation. No, not now. I had feared many things, doubted everyone, convinced myself I might never let anyone close again, but not with him. With Luca, I did not feel the need to build walls or hide the fractured parts of me. With him, I was simply myself, whole and fragile and beginning anew. I took his hand, weaving my fingers through his in a quiet vow. I don't know what tomorrow will look like. I can't promise anything far ahead, but if you're patient, I want to try. I want to begin again with myself, and with you. Luca did not answer immediately. He only tightened his hold on my hand, then leaned toward me slowly, as though giving me time to change my mind. His lips brushed mine lightly, like a breath, a kiss without demand or claim, but a gentle affirmation that he was here, that he had always been here. I closed my eyes, receiving the moment with all the honesty my heart could offer. The kiss did not last long, but it was deep in a way that slowed my pulse to a peaceful rhythm. When we pulled away, Luca rested his forehead against mine, whispering as if speaking to my soul rather than my ears. "I'm not going anywhere, Madison. However long you need, however many times you hesitate, I'll be here, not to push you forward, but to walk beside you if you want me to." I nodded, tears gathering without any shame. I had once believed love had to be fierce and consuming, something that swept you off your feet. But here, in the quiet circle of his arms, in a forest washed with golden light, I understood that true love is when your heart can exhale, when it can rest, when it can be itself without fear. That evening, we ate a simple meal of warm soup and bread, sitting by the fire, half watching an old movie neither of us was paying attention to. Sometimes our eyes met across the flickering glow, and those brief seconds were enough to tell me we had just laid the first stone of something lasting. Before bed, I took his hand once more, not for safety this time, but to share the peace settling gently inside me. I knew the road ahead would not always be smooth. I knew there would be moments when I stepped back, when fear returned, but I also knew I would not face any of it alone again. And sometimes, beginning anew does not require a promise of forever. It simply needs someone gentle enough to make love feel like something no longer worth fearing. The courtroom that morning was cold and unnervingly quiet, even though outside the sun was shining brightly as if a new day were beginning with hope. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped tightly together, my chest stretched so tight it felt as if it might break, yet my eyes stayed fixed straight ahead. Brandon sat only a few yards away in the defendant's chair, his immaculate suit unable to hide the pallor and tension on his face. Gone was the arrogance he carried the last time I saw him in the old apartment. Now he looked like an animal cornered with no escape, his eyes darting around in frantic search of a way out. The woman who had reported him sat on the opposite side with her attorney, her face thin but her gaze unwavering. I had never met her before, but when our eyes met, something quiet and unspoken passed between us, a shared understanding between two women whose dignity had been violated by the same man. When the court called my name, my heart lurched in my chest, as if it wanted to leap free. I stood, walked toward the witness stand, every step heavy but unstoppable. I had come too far to turn back. Standing before the microphone, I saw Luca at the far end of the room, his eyes holding steady on me, calm and grounding like an anchor in a rising tide. I drew in a long breath and began to speak. Every detail. Nothing omitted. I described the first time Brandon raised his voice at me in the apartment when I displeased him. The way he used words like blades to carve at my self-worth piece by piece. The bruises no one ever saw because I hid them well. And the long nights I lay awake, barely daring to breathe for fear he would wake. I spoke in a voice so steady it surprised even me. Perhaps because I had rehearsed these memories silently for so many nights. Or perhaps because I knew that now, my words mattered not only for myself but for everyone who had never been believed. The opposing attorney tried to push back, asking why I had not gone to the police earlier, why I stayed with him for so long. I did not dodge or defend. I said that when you love someone and they suffocate you with the wrong kind of love, you do not realize you are dying until you are nearly out of breath. And that fear does not keep a calendar. It has only one shape, and that shape is silence. The room went utterly still when I finished. No whispering, no clearing of throats. Only the soft scratching of the court reporter's pen and the thunder of my own heartbeat. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I did not look at Brandon. I did not need to. What I needed no longer lived in his direction. It lived in the way I walked away with my back straight, calm, and unafraid. The hearing lasted the entire day. 2 more witnesses came forward, people he had emotionally and physically abused, people who had once stayed silent because they were certain no one would believe them. But today, they spoke. When the court adjourned for the day, we stepped outside into the pale light. I stood on the courthouse steps, the breeze brushing lightly across my shoulders. Luca came to stand beside me, saying nothing. He simply took my hand, and that gentle pressure was enough for me to know he had been there through every moment I faced the darkest parts of my past. I looked at him, nodded softly. There was no need to say I had done what I needed to do. He knew, and so did I, not for revenge, but for closure, so I could live again. Not in fear, not in regret, but as someone reborn from the shadows. On the day of sentencing, the sky hung heavy and gray, like a thick curtain ready to release a cold rain at any moment. I sat in the courtroom with my fingers woven tightly together, no longer swept up in the storms of emotion that had once overtaken me, only an unfamiliar stillness. Not because I felt nothing, but because I knew my part of the journey was done. What happened next was beyond my control. But I had spoken. I had stood. I had done what I needed to do. Brandon entered with 2 officers at his sides. His gray suit hung loosely on him now, his face gaunt, his eyes, stripped of their usual evasiveness, filled instead with the blankness of a wall that had finally crumbled and no longer knew how to hide what was left behind. I looked at him one last time, feeling neither anger nor pity, only the simple truth that he was a man who had made the same cruel choice again and again, and now he would pay the price. The judge read the verdict slowly, each word pressing into the air, each sentence falling like a final nail into place. Brandon was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of early release for charges, including intentional assault, intimidation, domestic violence, and violation of a restraining order. When the gavel struck, I did not cry, gasp, or turn to anyone for reassurance. I simply closed my eyes for a brief moment and felt something inside me loosen, as if a chain I had worn for years had finally snapped. Sarah squeezed my hand, whispering something I could not fully hear, because my mind had drifted into a quiet inner space. In that moment, I no longer saw Brandon as the shadow stalking my dreams, no longer as the late-night knock at the door, no longer as the gaze that made me shrink whenever I passed a stranger on the street. He was simply a closed chapter, a door slammed shut. When we stepped outside, the rain began to fall, cold and soft like the sky shedding its own tears. Luca walked beside me, not rushing me, not offering hollow comfort. He knew, as he always did, that I did not need words. I only needed to know I was no longer alone. We stopped at a small corner cafe beneath a wooden awning. I sat with a cup of tea while Luca ordered his usual espresso. Watching the raindrops slide down the window, I felt something inside me grow unexpectedly light. Maybe tomorrow the nightmares would return. Maybe someday I would tremble again at unexpected memories. But today, in this moment, I was free. I turned to Luca and took his hand, not because I needed support, but because I wanted to share this small victory with the man who had walked beside me through the darkest stretches. He smiled, and there was no surprise in his expression, only a calm certainty, as if he had always believed this day would come. I exhaled slowly, and for the first time in many years, my lungs felt full of true, clean air. My story did not end with a miracle. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic collapse into someone's arms. Just me, sitting in a small cafe on a cold early winter afternoon, knowing that one chapter of my life had been closed by justice rather than bitterness, and knowing I could begin a new chapter without carrying the stains of my past. I did not forgive Brandon, but I forgave myself, for trusting the wrong person, for staying silent, for believing I was not strong enough to walk away. But today, I know I did, and I will keep going. We never chose a specific day to call our relationship official. There was no proposal, no roses or candlelight, no teary speeches like in the Fidery movies. But after the day the trial ended, when everything seemed to shatter and then go still, we simply began choosing each other every single day through the smallest things. Luca slowly moved his belongings into the apartment where I was living, without fanfare, without announcements. One day his familiar leather jacket was hanging on the hook by the door. Another day his toothbrush appeared in the cup by the sink. And then, when I opened the kitchen cabinet and saw his favorite cereal, I realized he was already here, woven into every corner of my life, as if it had always been meant to be that way. We learned to live together through understanding rather than trying to claim space from one another. I still had my quiet mornings reading by the window, and he still had his evenings working in silence at the desk near the living room. Yet there were always the soft brushes of our shoulders when we passed each other, the glances exchanged when no one was watching, and the quiet gestures that spoke more than any words could. Once I asked Luca whether he felt things between us were moving too fast. He simply shook his head, smiled, and said that when you have lived long enough in fear, you deserve a happiness that does not require waiting, and nothing about this felt fast to him, only right. We started spending weekends walking through the park near our place, sometimes driving out of the city to the woodland trail he loved so much. I planted more flowers on the balcony, and he fixed the loose bookshelf in the bedroom. On rainy evenings we played soft music, cooked together in the small kitchen, and when everything had settled, he wrapped his arms around me from behind, his cheek resting on my shoulder, saying nothing at all, just being there. Love with Luca was never loud. It did not arrive like a storm, but like a warm wind that slipped into every fracture inside me, gentle, persistent, and steadfast. I began writing again, not to recount pain but to speak about renewal. The stories I wrote now carried a different color, no longer shadowed but threaded with light at the edges of every page. Luca was always the first to read what I wrote, always careful, always leaving notes in the margins, sometimes a line of encouragement, sometimes a look of quiet pride. Life returned to a steady rhythm, no more nightly nightmares, no more wary glances on the street. I no longer startled at the sound of the door unlocking or held my breath when the phone rang. Instead, I felt the peacefulness of a life no longer lived in defense. I knew there were still uncertainties ahead, that nothing could guarantee eternal calm, but I also knew I would not be facing any of it alone. I had Luca, not as a hero swooping in to save me, but as someone walking beside me, willing to step back when I needed space, and willing to stay when I needed a shoulder. One night, after we had settled under the covers, I turned to him and whispered, "Thank you." He opened his eyes and looked at me with a gaze that was half soft sorrow, half tenderness. "What are you thanking me for?" he asked. "For staying. For not leaving when I was still broken." Luca squeezed my hand gently and pulled me into his arms. "I am not here out of pity," he whispered into my hair. "I am here because I love you, because you are you, and that is enough." I smiled, closed my eyes, and felt my heart grow light, like a cloth shaken free of dust after a long journey. For the first time in many years, I no longer measured time by my wounds. I measured it by dinners shared, by trips to the grocery store, by the small laughter echoing through the kitchen, and by the way he held my hand in silence, as if that alone was enough to begin an entirely new life. That afternoon, Luca and I walked along the quiet riverbank on the outskirts of the city, where the water drifted gently beneath the clear sky, and the distant sound of birdsong floated on the wind. The path was covered in golden leaves, each step we took sending a soft rustle through the air like the whisper of time itself. We held hands, speaking little, letting the presence of the other settle comfortably around us. I stopped at a bend in the path where an old wooden bench faced the water. The breeze lifted my hair, carrying the faint chill of late autumn, yet warmth unfurled inside me, steady and deep. I sat down, looking far into the glowing horizon. Luca sat beside me, his eyes following the lines of my face, just as he had done ever since we began this new life together. I turned to him with a small, certain smile and said, without hesitation, "I am free now." The words were light as wind, yet they struck something profound inside me, like a bell chiming in the quiet of the soul. Free from the past, from fear, from the guilt and shame that had once weighed heavily on my shoulders. Free to love, to live, to be wholly myself again. Luca squeezed my hand, saying nothing, but his gaze carried 1,000 unspoken understandings, because he had witnessed every step of my journey, from a broken woman to the woman who now sat beside him, brave enough to declare her right to happiness. We stayed there for a long while, letting time drift, letting our emotions settle like the calm surface of the river after a passing ripple. I thought of everything I had lived through, the sleepless nights, the unseen wounds, the countless times I had wondered whether I deserved love at all. And now, in that moment of stillness, I knew none of the pain had been meaningless. It had made me stronger, braver, more truthful to myself. This story is not only about suffering or justice, it is about rebirth, about the possibility of rebuilding trust from rubble, about a love that is not rescue but companionship. Above all, it is a reminder that everyone deserves a second chance, not just from others, but from themselves. If you are watching this video and you too have walked through a dark stretch of life, I want you to know you are not alone. Healing is not easy, but it is real. And sometimes all it takes is one patient, kind person to hold a light steady enough for you to find your way back to yourself. How do you feel listening to this story? Does it remind you of someone, of an experience, or perhaps of your own journey? We would love to hear from you, to listen to the thoughts that rise from the quietest part of your heart. Please leave a comment below this video, share your story, or simply send a message to let us know you are there, listening, and connecting. And if you found meaning in this story, do not forget to like the video, share it with someone you believe might need to hear it, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you can join us every day for more heartfelt stories filled with emotion and humanity. Thank you for spending this time with us. We will see you in the next video with another story, another journey, and another message. Wishing every one of you watching this peace, good health, gentle days, and a heart that feels lighter with each sunrise. Goodbye, and see you again soon.